Well, thank you very much for seeing us, Your Grace. And I was wondering if you'd like to start off by maybe introducing yourself, saying a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm Bishop Angaelos. I'm General Bishop of the Coptic Orthodox Church here in the United Kingdom. Originally from Egypt, lived in Australia for a lot of my life, and then went back to Egypt to join the monastery. Served as secretary to the late Pope Shenouda for 6 years. Was sent out here as a monk priest in 1995 for 4 years. Then I became a bishop in 1999. So I've been here for almost 20 years. I oversee not only pastoral matters as assistant to the Pope in his parishes, but I also look after our ecumenical and interreligious work here in the United Kingdom.
I was wondering if you could sort of give me some background on what it means when you say Coptic Orthodox. It may not be a term that's familiar to many of your listeners.
The word Coptic just means Egyptian. It comes from Greek Aegyptos. So to say Coptic Orthodox is just like saying Greek or Russian Orthodox. So just the word Coptic Orthodox just means Egyptian. It denotes the Church of Egypt, and Christianity has been in Egypt since the 1st century. St. Mark, the writer of the second Gospel, preached Christianity there in the year about 55 AD. And we've had a continuous presence of Christianity in Egypt since then. The church at the moment is the largest Christian denomination in the Middle East. Between 10 and 15% of the population of Egypt. And Copts outside of Egypt are probably 10%. So there hasn't been any massive exodus. We don't consider ourselves as diaspora communities outside, but Copts in migration. It's also important to see the connection with the other Orthodox churches, ecumenically also with Christian churches here in the United Kingdom and throughout the world, as well as our interreligious work, obviously stemming from Christian-Muslim relations in Egypt that have been ongoing. And I think we have something to add in that context, providing a very practical means of conversation, knowing what to dialogue on and what not to dialogue on, knowing what we can work together on and what we can present a common witness on. Matters of religious freedom, human rights, reconciliation, all of these things.
Thank you. What would you say would be the sort of unique practices or beliefs that would mark somebody as being following this particular tradition?
Well, being an Orthodox church, we are scriptural, so we Old and New Testaments. We're sacramental, so we have the sacraments. We have the Eucharist, baptism, chrismation. A traditional church, meaning we follow the writings of the fathers of the early centuries. In terms of practice, Copts are quite faithful in their worship, so they will attend liturgies regularly, probably weekly, take communion. We have a sense of community where people come together as well, especially outside of Egypt, and especially here in the United Kingdom, where we don't have extended families. So we have our congregation here is made up of nuclear families. So the church here becomes their extended family. So it's not uncommon for people to come on a Sunday and start on the day with a liturgy and then stay for the whole day, where you have Sunday school, Bible studies, activities, sports activities, social events. The church becomes very much a part of who they are.
And what sort of role, you mentioned very briefly the kind of ecumenical dialogue that the church was engaging in here in the UK. Would you like to broaden that a little bit?
Well, we are members of Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, which is the ecumenical body throughout Britain and Ireland, and Churches Together in England. As a church, and then as our parishes go, they are members of their local Churches Together groups. We have through our Oriental family as well. We have a regional forum with the Church of England, a regional forum with the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales. we interact at various levels through the daily life of the Church here in the United Kingdom. We interact in matters that I think make a difference. So we will support other churches. We will support calls for prayer when there is persecution somewhere or advocacy somewhere. And I think it's important for us to do that. I personally attend General Synod of the Church of England. I also have various relationships serving in various capacities within the Christian Church throughout Britain.
Excellent. And sort of in terms of interfaith dialogue beyond that ecumenical engagement?
In the interfaith arena, I am moderator of something called the Church's Interreligious Network, which is a network of all the interreligious workers in all the Christian churches across the 4 nations. It is a network of churches together in Britain Island. So that is very helpful in pursuing relationships with other religions. I'm also a member of the Christian Muslim Forum as a scholar consultant. And again, I think bringing our own Egyptian context and our Coptic context into how we've lived diversity and how we've lived as a minority, and how we can communicate practically and pragmatically to work towards reconciliation, coexistence, is one thing we can really bring to the table, as well as, of course, learning. And I think it's an interaction where I don't profess, neither personally nor as a church, to have all wisdom, but we actually learn from each other. I learned quite a lot from being in these bodies, in these associations, learning from colleagues. And so therefore being able to enrich our own experience while also presenting what we do and hoping that enriches someone else.
Could you perhaps expand a little on the experience of the Coptic Church in Egypt? I mean, you mentioned, living as a minority. I know Egypt's been a very challenging place in the last year or so, certainly maybe a little longer than that. Could you expand a little bit on the experience of your community and the ways in which you're working to achieve that reconciliation?
Up to the end of the first millennium, Egypt was reportedly 85% Christian. But then with the Islam having come in the 7th century, at the beginning of the second millennium, there was a greater Islamization, Arabization of Egypt, which meant it wasn't enough to be a Muslim living in Egypt. Egypt became a Muslim country. And obviously that presented huge hurdles for the Christian population. It dropped significantly then from 85% to 15%, which is roughly what it is until today. Of course there are challenges, especially when you have a country that is plagued by poverty and illiteracy, which makes people much more easier to radicalize and manipulate, where you have myths of churches and monasteries being storehouses for weapons and ammunition and gold, which obviously was proven absolutely wrong over the past few years. We've become targeted just for being Christians. One thing we don't do, though, is we don't adopt a victim mentality. So we pass through all of this, we live through it, but we also exist through it. And we exist through it powerfully. The church is still there, the churches are full, the ministry is thriving, our monasteries are alive. We present a very real support for our members in their own homes and through their communities. The experience also has meant that we have to live a very peaceful life. I think the only reason Christians are still there, and it's an anomaly, you have a Christian minority within an Islamic state, within the Islamic region that's very inflamed. And I think in that context, we've had to live very peacefully, and the only way I can explain the continued presence of Christians is that we've never taken up arms, we've never been aggressive, we've never been violent. Even in the attacks on over 50 churches and 50 other Christian places just last August, the reaction was absolutely no retaliation. It was peaceful, it was reconciliatory, even being at the receiving end. Of course, in the lead up to that, there was a lot of incitement. In the 2 years after the uprising, in the midst of the near anarchy that happened and the greater Islamist activity that was in Egypt, we experienced attacks on Christians and churches that we hadn't experienced in the 20 years prior. And I think it was very important to see that that was actually very symbolic of a much deeper unrest. But with the Muslim Brotherhood having become more active and taking a more leadership role through the presence of Muhammad Morsi as president, I think it was important then that Christians who were accused of being Western sympathizers and wanting Western interjections were the ones who were saying no. And they proved how loyal they were, and they proved their sense of national identity and how patriotic they were. And people then started seeing them in a very different way, as Egyptians who were just Christians. It didn't mean they were enemies. Of course, there are still people on the fringe who won't accept that, and either time will change them or nothing will change them. But we will continue to live as we live and do what we do, I think.
Do you think that the example of the way in which the Coptic community have responded to that kind of extremism is one that could be adopted by other Christian communities in the Middle East?
I think the example presented by Coptic Christians last August is one that can be adopted by, or should be adopted by, any religious community. Because our faith as Christians tells us that we need to love even those who consider themselves our enemies and attack us. Egypt is a different place to the rest of the Middle East, however, because Egypt doesn't have the same tribal makeup of its community. It is a much more rural setting, so it's very difficult to bring one part of the country against the other. There are always prophets of doom who are saying that Egypt will become like Syria and you'd have a civil war. That's very unlikely in Egypt. In places like Iraq, Syria, Libya, because of the tribal setup and because of the huge diversity of varying religious groups there, that separation was easier. Whereas in Egypt, it's a rural setting, people blend in. Their natural inclination is to live as communities. And so unless you have very vulnerable areas that are impoverished or illiterate, where radicals can go in and significantly change mindsets, that's not something that can be easily adopted. So I would like to say yes, but unfortunately the demographics of Egypt tend to be slightly different to the rest of the Middle East.
That's fascinating. Thank you. If we were going to be, if you wanted my colleagues to have sort of 3 or 4 key takeaways from our conversation today, or maybe even things that we haven't talked about but you think that they should know, what would they be?
I think the fundamental things I'd like people to know are A, that there are Christians in Egypt. The number of times I get asked by very bewildered people, so there is Christianity, and they don't realize it was a place of Christianity from the 1st century. It was a place of refuge of Christ himself, the infant Christ, when he fled Israel. And the church there is powerful, it's living, it's thriving. There is a significant numeric minority. And it has things to offer. What I also hasten to tell people is that they shouldn't be trying to export wisdom, because Western models that tend to work here for us, and some imperfectly, are not necessarily going to work for the Middle East. And so to try to export a sense of what democracy should be, or what process should be, I think is quite dangerous, because it's almost set up for failure. I think people should listen more and understand the community and understand the demographic, and then try to help within that contextual understanding, rather than drop an understanding in that isn't really going to fit. And I think the final thing is that interjections that cause greater division are not helpful to anyone. I think what must be done is that we all strive for reconciliation. Reconciliation, however, does not work when there is crime being committed. So you can't reconcile with someone who continues to break the law and continues to criminally attack you, because the playing fields are very different. So I think we need to encourage people to reconcile, but also encourage them first to come to the table with a similar presence and a similar expectation and a similar input, and really want a solution at the end of the day that caters for everyone, rather than just coming to push for their own point of view.
Would it be possible to have like a little bit more detail on what makes a church an Orthodox church as opposed to another kind of church? Because I think one or two of my colleagues might not be quite so well informed on that.
When one walks into an Orthodox church, and especially in our Coptic church, you'll first be met by icons. Iconography is very important to us, and these aren't just pictures, they are theology. They're written in a certain way, they have certain meanings. Of course, there are some who accuse us of worshipping idols. The way I like to explain this is these are just big PowerPoint presentations. They are visual explanations of a theology and understanding. So these icons are very important. The other thing, of course, is the use of hymnology. So everything we say liturgically is chanted. Mm-hmm. We don't use instruments in the church except a small triangle and small cymbals to keep the beat. But everything else is chanted, so the human voice is the only instrument we use. And we have a very rich tradition of hymnology, whether it be liturgically or in other prayers. The scriptures are very focal to everything we do, whether our liturgical worship, whether it's our other forms of worship, our teaching. The scriptures are core, and you'll find a lot of biblical scripture being recited in the day-to-day life of the church. We also have daily prayers, daily offices almost, and they revolve around the Psalms, and then scripture, and then some prayers adding to that as well. So all in all, because of the monastic foundation of the church, being the birthplace of monasticism in the 3rd century with St. Anthony the Great, a church that has inputted significantly into the ecumenical life of the Church of God through the ecumenical councils traditionally, but even today, and through an incredible heritage of martyrdom and sacrifice. I think you'll find that all of that plays into the day-to-day life of the church.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Excellent.
Great.